I'll briefly introduce the panel that we have for you today, and then I'll invite them to talk about their journey. So we have Gail Scott Spicer, who is CEO of King's College Hospital Charity. We have Stephen Burke, who's Director of United for All Ages. And we have Michelle Doyle Wildman, who is CEO of Political Studies Association. So speaking to Gail, first of all, just in terms of a brief snapshot of your journey from comms to CEO, talk us through it.
Sure, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So my last role as a Comms Pro was I was Director of Marketing Communications at the Scout Association, and that was the last role I held in that profession before I became a CEO. I always worked in not-for-profit and always in comms, including back when I was 20, I was a press officer at London Transport and held lots of different roles, but always in those areas. So I held 3 deputy CEO or director roles over about 11 years before making that move. And I've been interested for probably about 7 years in trying to become a CEO before I achieved that, trying on 2 separate kind of job moves, if you like, to break through that barrier. So I guess I had a purposeful plan and it was a deliberate move. And I've now had several roles as a chief executive. And I'm also a trustee of 2 charities, including the Premier League's charity. So great to be with you.
Thanks, Gail. Stephen, what about your journey?
Thanks, Mike, and afternoon, everyone. In my experience, chief execs are either kind of lifers in one organisation who work their way up through that organisation, or they've worked in a variety of different organisations. And I think that's increasingly the latter, and I think that's true with a lot of PR people as well. I had PR jobs with 5 national organisations in the 1980s and 1990s, and worked with half a dozen very different but inspiring leaders and built a wide range of networks in that time. I also, during those last 2 of those jobs, got experience on the senior management team and working with the boards of trustees as well. At the same time, I got more interested in leadership through being a trade union representative negotiating with management, then also sitting a bit like Gail on the boards of a range of local and national organisations and becoming a local authority councillor as well. And that experience, that broad experience, gave me a bigger picture beyond the day job and gave me more confidence as well and a higher profile. And whilst I was a council cabinet member, I worked freelance for several national charities and worked closely with several CEOs, and one of them left after four years of us working together. So I applied for the CEO job and got it. It was a campaigning charity, so it was ideal for a PR person, but it was also growing and developing in terms of its service delivery. About 5 years later, I got a second CEO job with another charity, another care charity. And after 10 years as CEO, my wife and I decided to set up a social enterprise, which is United for All Ages. We did that in 2010, and we've run it ever since. I don't think I started out wanting to be a CEO, but in my mid-30s, I discovered more of an interest and I think an aptitude to be a leader, and was encouraged by others to go for it. Of course, there were other opportunities and twists and turns on the way, which I'm happy to discuss later. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Stephen. And Michelle, you describe yourself as the accidental CEO, don't you? Do you want to kind of?
Yes. I'm. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm in awe of Stephen and Gail's journey. Mine was somewhat different. So I was a comms professional for about 20 years before I took the leap into working for a charity, and I was in post as policy and comms director for about a year for the charity that was previously known as education and membership body education charity called PTA UK, and I was policy and comms director there, part of a 3-woman executive team, when suddenly and seriously my boss, the CEO, became ill, and we had no idea how long obviously this would go on for. So the situation for me was actually quite quickly I came to the conclusion that the best thing for the organisation and for the staff team in such circumstances was to take the reins. And I can safely say I hadn't really previously made that intellectual leap, as Stephen has described or Gail has described, around seeing myself in that role. But it seemed like it was the most necessary thing to do, though I knew that it would personally be very stretching. The other executive director in the team was about to leave to take a fantastic new job in another organisation. So I was literally the last woman standing, and I was the sole executive team member for about a year after that. So it meant that actually I was still very hands-on with the comms. In fact, one of the things that was material in my decision is that we'd made the decision to do the full Monty of a rebrand, new name, new strategy, new visual identity, and the charity became Parent Kind during my tenure as interim CEO. So the I was very kind of hands-on. I found the learning curve was steep, but I also discovered new depths about myself in doing so, and I've crossed the floor now, and being a chief executive is now my direction. And I'm now, so I moved about 18 months ago into being a chief executive of the Political Studies Association. So still in the not-for-profit sector, but a very different animal than my time at Parent Kind, which I think one of the points I made in the guide was that there are all sorts of different chief execs, and different organisations need different types of chief exec at a different time. And I think that's one of the things. And in terms of what happened to me, I think I was the right woman for the job, but it certainly transformed me and has set me in a completely different direction.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. So that's just a brief snapshot of those journeys, and shows just how diverse those journeys can be. But really, one of the points of the discussions that I had with the people who interviewed for the report was about their learning and development journey to take them there. So in terms of thinking about the learning and development steps you took that others can learn from, what were those? And I'd like to start that with Stephen.
Thanks, Mike. I'd probably give, I think, 6 quick tips. And the first one is, and this is a key skill of leaders, but watching and listening, and watching and listening wherever you are. Every leader is different, but you can learn from everyone you come across who is a CEO, however good or bad they are. The second point is about networking, and I make this point in the guide, but networking vigorously is absolutely key, and maintaining and nurturing your networks, and using LinkedIn and other social media as well. The third one is about, and I touched on already, is about getting leadership experience elsewhere, and that's whether it's joining a board of management or a trustee, but also looking at, whilst you're doing that, identifying and filling some of your skills gaps, looking at what are transferable skills. And sometimes I don't think PR people are good at possibly doing that. We have a lot of transferable skills, and then obviously gaining confidence as part of that approach. The fourth thing is about, I think, being strategic, both in your approach to your current work and your current role, but also thinking about what kind of organization do you want to lead? What kind of organizations do you admire? Who are the chief execs you admire? The fifth point is, it's quite a lonely job, being chief exec, and I do recommend you either get a mentor, and having a mentor on the way to becoming a chief exec is really helpful, but also it's important to get some peer support from outside your organization and through some of the chief exec organizations that are already out there. I was quite involved in Akivo, the voluntary organizations one. And then the final point, and this is slightly ironic, but PR people are good at doing the comms for their own organization, but not necessarily so good at doing PR for themselves. And I think, I mentioned LinkedIn, but you've got to sell yourself, because no one else will go out and tell the world about what you've done and your successes and achievements. So do that through LinkedIn. Make sure you enter awards, and make sure people know when you've won those awards. So there's a few things that certainly helped me on the way to becoming chief exec.
Okay, and anything to build on there, Michelle?
Yes, I couldn't agree more with what Stephen has pointed out. And I think making your personal development a priority is absolutely essential as you continue in your kind of leadership journey. I think whatever form it takes, that's important, and having that kind of open learning mindset as well. And Akivo was very important to me as well. I signed up to the Emerging Leaders Program, or Senior Leaders Program, that they do there. And in fact, Gail, I think you came and gave a presentation about your journey, and I was like, okay, then I still hadn't made the leap that I could do it too, Gail, but at least I saw somebody who was role modeling that, and also that I was, fascinated with, obviously, the strategic approach that you took. So I think that's really important. You learn a lot on the job, of course. I found doing courses quite interesting, particularly about understanding charities a bit more as well. So I certainly went on formal courses as well. And not to be a bit, too toady, I've kept up my CIPR CPD as well. So I've kept my hand in on the comms side too, which for me was quite important and refreshing.
Okay. And Gail, anything to add?
Very supportive, in agreement with my colleagues. I think also for me, the big shift from being a director to being a CEO is around governance. And the people appointing you, which is going to be the chair and the boards, need to feel, have a real sense that you're going to be able to cope with that significant shift. So I think one of the challenges whenever you take a step is, how do you get the experience that people are looking for when you've not done that before? So for me, it was about getting exposure. And I spoke to my chief executive at the time when I was a director and said, these are my aspirations. And this is, I think, a gap I have, and can you help me get some exposure to that within our organisation, even though it's clearly not my role? And he was very supportive of that, and supported me to be involved in some governance working groups, for example. And then I think the other way you can prove that, or evidence it, is through getting trustee roles. And Stephen talked about slightly different external roles, which I think would also give that sort of experience. But certainly in the third sector, having a very experienced comms professional on your board is something that lots of boards would find very desirable.
That's great, thanks, Gail. And actually, one of the things that Gavin Elwood, who's a headhunter, echoed is that the ability to have some board experience alongside your comms experience really does enable you to kind of step up. So that, I think that's come across from everybody, but also from the wider, not wider, but the different perspective of somebody who's actually placing people into CEO roles. Getting that board experience is a kind of a really, really vital step, I think. So we've touched on that learning and development, and again, it resonates with lots of the other stuff that's in the report. Lorraine Langan talking about widening her remit out from a purely comms role almost iteratively to get that experience. And so I think that there's a lot of commonality there, I think. So we've touched on the learning and development steps, but also in terms of what comms people bring to a CEO role. Before I took on this project, I wrote a brief blog, which is almost a love letter from comms people to boards, saying, this is why we're good for you. But I'm not a CEO, so from those on the panel, what do you think comms people specifically bring to the role that makes them really good as a CEO? And I'll start that with Michelle.
Thank you. Clearly, we're a very broad church, and that there's a broad range of skills that comms professionals now bring. But I think in terms of what I've reflected on, I think the key things are that when we naturally put people at the centre. And we're also skilled strategists and great decision makers. And we also understand the importance of values in leadership, whether it's about being authentic, being ethical, collaborative, or visionary, or any other values. I think comms people absolutely get that. So to develop that a bit further, I think leadership is very much about being present. Present for your staff, for your customers, for your stakeholders. And comms folk are really good at this because we are, as Stephen says, expert listeners, and we can see things from the perspective of others. And time again, I I realised that it kind of comes naturally to me, but it's not a natural thing for everyone. So these are vital skills that you bring as a leader. We understand the need to be accountable. We have the skills to stay on message, to tell a story, and we can use Twitter better than the average. So all of these things are really good. Being digitally savvy is so important as a modern leader of any organisation. But I think the greatest gift we bring is being strategists and great decision makers. It's what I'm falling back on over and over again. All those years of juggling money, resources and time, making evidence-based decisions, having kind of a willingness to learn from mistakes, all of these traits that comms professionals do day in, day out really will stand you in good stead when you take the top job. I'm still sometimes the only one in the room asking, what's our objective? Who are our target audience? What impact do we want and how are we going to measure it? So these are things that you're asking day in, day out as well, and that will still stand you in good stead when you rise up the ranks.
Okay. Gail, from your perspective?
Yeah, thank you. I think certainly to build on, in addition to some of the things that Michelle said, not to replicate, I guess reputation is something that is also in all of our DNA and protecting it. And reputation is a major board risk and responsibility. So as the CEO, that's something which is key to your role and to supporting your board with. So I think it's a major attribute that comms people bring to a CEO role, and who best to steward it than an experienced comms person. I also agree with Michelle around, I was thinking about comms people have the customer and the beneficiary in their DNA, and it's our focus every working day and beyond. So sort of echoing some of those points that Michelle made. And emotional intelligence is really crucial in modern leadership, and comms people have really highly tuned radars, able to kind of read people and situations and anticipate and act and take people with them. And all of those things are things that I think are needed and actually are asked for. So they're great things to be able to talk about in applications and then in interviews.
Okay, Stephen?
Michelle mentioned being strategic as being absolutely key, and I would certainly agree with that. And comms people should be strategic in everything that they do. I say in the guide, or I'm quoted in the guide as saying that the chief exec should be good communicators, and I think that's absolutely essential. And so hopefully, comms people are that to start with. And as Michelle said, that is about as much about listening as it is about talking. But I think in addition to that, I know quite a lot of chief execs who are on Twitter, for example, social media, but actually they got very little to say. And I think hopefully comms people might actually have a bit more of a message and a real edge to what they say as well, which is actually quite distinctive as opposed to some of the bland stuff that does go out. The other key thing, and kind of following on from what Gail's saying about beneficiaries and so on, I mean, I think comms people will focus as much on the story and the why we, the organization exists, what it's there to do, as much as the how, and really explain and simplify what the organization is about, and get that message out both internally and externally. And obviously comms people should be good at building relationships within and without the organization as well. I think the only other thing I would add is, in these times, horizon scanning is so important, really being aware about what's coming up and what's going to hit us. And, if we were having this conversation a year ago, none of us would be mentioning COVID, probably. But look what's happened. And I know even in the NHS, people weren't talking about COVID a year ago, even though the warnings were beginning to be out there. So it is about that kind of just really, really looking outwards and seeing what's coming down the track. And that's so important for risk management, which again is a key role for chief execs and the boards.
Okay, thank you all. So there's the kind of there's the process to get there. But then there's the when you finally kind of land in that seat, and obviously everybody on this call, that's their aspiration. Oh, can somebody mute, please? So once you finally land in that seat, then I guess the key question is whether any surprises. Now I know Gail, you mentioned the kind of the question that somebody asked you early on about the money. So would you like to lead off on this one?
Yeah, absolutely. So were there any surprises? Yes. And I think there probably always is to some extent, because you do your due diligence and you speak to people who know that organisation or who know people who are in it. And then when you go through the process, of course, you have all sorts of conversations from the headhunter through to the people involved themselves, and hopefully you'll get to meet beneficiaries and staff as well as chairs and trustees. But inevitably, there will be things that are a surprise, and sometimes they're a surprise to the people that you've spoken to as much as to yourself when you discover them. So yes, for me, financial challenge has been a theme for me when you arrive. So on my first day of being in a role, I was in my handover session from the interim CEO, and we'd been talking for probably 2 hours upwards, and we were packing away, and she just kind of stopped for a moment and looked at me and put her head on one side and said, "They have told you about the money, haven't they?" "No," I said. So then we unpacked and had another long conversation. And, you know, I'd shown the published books to a finance director who's very highly regarded. And yet, so I'd done everything I possibly could to know that what I was going into, but actually, in that particular instance, the organisation hadn't been completely transparent with me. And I think that's not good, clearly, but also it's just a highlight of what happens sometimes when you go somewhere. And another time a chair did flag some financial challenges to me, and I arrived and dug around, and about 6 weeks later, having changed the finance director to try and really get underneath what was going on, there was a much bigger problem than anyone realised. And so those are two examples. I think talking to colleagues around the sector, they're not that unusual, sadly. And I think there's big lessons for all of us when we're recruiting people at any level, actually, to try and be as open, as honest as you can be, because you'll get the right person for the job and they'll come in better prepared as well. But I think for you arriving somewhere and discovering surprises, whatever they are, whether they're financial or other, you then have to understand them and then have pretty quick and frank conversations with your chair and board, because they probably weren't expecting what you're now going to need to do. And you've got to go on the journey, they've got to go on the journey with you of understanding what's needing to happen and to be kind of supportive of you in that. And I think just the reality is most jobs at any level, you have to go in prepared for blind spots, your own, the executives, the boards. And in being prepared for that and anticipating it, going in, which Stephen talked about earlier as well, having people to turn to, because there will be surprises. And so having some people already that you're working with, whether it's a mentor, as Stephen said, or other networks, are going to be invaluable.
Okay. Michelle? Any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't agree, I wouldn't agree more really with what Gail set out there. In fact, when I was looking for new jobs, I went straight to the finances. Looking straight at the finances is always the first thing you look at. And I don't know whether it's more obviously more an issue for not-for-profit and charity sector, but yeah, that's what I've learned as well, trying to get behind the figures. For me, one thing that I'm absolutely certain about, which surprised me, was that being a chief executive has made me a better communicator. So it feeds both ways, and I think it's about that being on both sides of the table, if you like, on that front. But certainly being in that top job has honed my skills, and that's probably was a surprise. I probably thought that I would let some things ebb away, but in fact that's not been the case. The thing that really struck me was that you have to be able to flip very quickly from different sorts of decisions. that you're called upon to make. And it's not unusual to be asked in normal times, can you just sign off on the choice of sandwiches for the board meeting 1 minute, and then the next you're having to look at a really, you know, large project that needs to be approved. So I think that's something that surprised me, and you have to have that ability to flip from one to the other. And of course, for some of us who's ever been a crisis comms role, you're quite used to being in the firing line on that front. So and I would agree totally about the amount of time, important time, that it takes to build a relationship with your board and chair is vital. And that may surprise people that a big chunk of your job involves that part.
Okay, Stephen?
I definitely agree. I mean, the point about money and resources generally is the one that hits people first of all. And certainly my first job as a CEO, I basically had enough money to pay the salaries for the first 2 months, and that was it. And there was nothing else beyond that, really. And it does make you resourceful, and I'll come back to that in a second. The second area, which I mean, it kind of linked to resource, is all about people. So Michelle highlighted the board issue. Also, your senior management team as well that you inherit. There may well be some issues that you have to sort out there. And the third one, again, around people, is about, it's either, particularly in the charity world, there may be an issue about founder syndrome, someone who's been there a long time, won't really let go, even though they've kind of moved on, or chief execs who've been there a long time and then perhaps have left a lot of very traditional ways of doing things, which are very much difficult to change. So I think you just need to be aware about the people as well as the financial stuff. Having said all of that, I think there are ways around it. So you know, you do your homework and try and find people who will tell you some honest truths if you can, and ask around. But do make sure you hit the ground running, because you're going to have to go in and really motor from day one. And try and get some what I call quick wins, both internally and externally, just so that people notice you're there, but and you can actually deliver. And I think that's important as externally as well. And I think you know, you just got to remember, like a lot of things, you're at your most powerful in your first 6 months, really, in any new job. You know, you can actually make quite a lot of changes in that time. And you've got to make the most of that first 6 months, really. And you'll be surprised, actually. You'll have a lot of friends, people you might not expect, but there will be friends of the organisation and people who are willing to help you outside of the organisation, who can help see you through some of the stickier moments as well during that time, and possibly come up with the cash as well.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. So there's a kind of a strong sense that the journey when you get there is an interesting place to be. And some of the other people talked about a surprise about stress, and I'd just like to check this with the team, because a sense, I think it was Ruth from Islington Housing Association who said that she felt that there was potentially less stress in a CEO role because you have a greater locus of control. It's harder to manage upwards and create change than it is to lead the change from the top. Does that resonate with the panel?
Yep.
I'm getting lots of yeses. Yeah. Okay, great. We're nearly at a point where we'll move on to kind of opening up to questions. But just one, I haven't told the panel I'm asking this, but if you were going back to give one piece of career advice to your early career self, I was just wondering whether you have any thoughts as to what that might be. I'm looking to see who's got the least blank face that I can go to first. Michelle.
I think it's probably leap sooner. Do it sooner.
Okay,
That's
and again,
all.
I think that came across from some of the other interviews as well. Gail?
Yeah, I was thinking about have faith, which I think is connected to that. You know, have faith in yourself. you will at some point be the best person in the room to do that job, and that particular job, which came up earlier as well. Different CEOs with different skills for different roles. So go for it, I guess.
Yeah, and that's absolutely, again, that came across quite strongly, is the kind of the sense that do we as a professional have that self-confidence, and if not, why don't we? And I think that'll come out in further questions. But Stephen, your one piece of advice to your earlier.
I definitely the go for it bit. I had a great job in my early 20s when I was editor of the student newspaper for all the colleges in Bristol. So it wasn't both universities and the FE colleges, and it was fantastic. It was a real responsibility at the age of 21, quite a big budget and everything else. And I wish after that I'd kind of really motored, and I think I probably wasted too much of my 20s, and partially because it was about confidence. I didn't have the confidence to really go for the bigger jobs, and it wasn't until I was 30, and I had a fantastic opportunity when I was 30 to go on a Harkness fellowship with my wife, and spent a whole year watching leaders from the British public sector studying in the USA, and that just gave me the confidence to go for it in my 30s. And it just, you know, it was one of those twists and turns which I hadn't anticipated. And but so all I say to people is don't waste time either. You know, just go for it.
And I think a point Michelle made in the point that resonates with that is the spend time with your future kind quote, which I quite liked. Is that sense of kind of, you know, identify leaders that you admire and find ways to get as closer than you can, and that they could be within your own organization or elsewhere. Yeah. Okay, we've got some questions coming in from our audience, so a few of those. First of all, for Stephen specifically, how is it moving from a freelance role to a CEO role? Were people accepting of you stepping back into the corporate world from the outside?
Yes, I mean, partially because of the freelance role that I had, I was working very closely with the organisation and with the chief exec and most of the staff team at the time. It was an organisation with 8 staff, so so I was able, as in the comms role, on kind of a 2-day-a-week basis, to work pretty closely with a lot of the staff. So they knew me well, but I think the key thing was the chief exec at the time had been very supportive, I mean, and very up for the communications and getting the message out and raising the profile of the organisation, as were the board. And I think the board had appreciated the impact that we'd made on the comms front, which is hopefully why they employed me then.
Okay, thank you. A wider one for everyone. You all started as CEOs of charities. Do you think it's easier to start as a CEO of a charity? Michelle's nodding.
Well, what I would say, I think, was that I made the leap into the charity world. I felt I worked for a government agency for many years, and I felt, well, if I have to move now or I have to just stick it forever. So I made the leap. But when I went into the charity sector, what I noticed immediately is that it seemed to be a space where there was more opportunities for women, I would say. And that they, you know, when you walk into, I was in a male dominated you know, kind of scientific engineering sort of career before that. In some ways, didn't really think much of it, and it was so starkly different in the charity world. So I think that I can't really comment as to whether it's how it differs from the corporate world, but I certainly think that for women perhaps wanting to freshen up their career, try a different route, if they feel blocked at the moment, then maybe consider charities or not-for-profit as a way of unblocking their career.
Okay. Anything else to add?
Well, the only thing I agree about charities. I'm particularly passionate about a whole range of social policy issues, which, you know, charities are obviously major players in that arena. So, and it's a good way of getting change done. And as we mentioned earlier, it's a good way of having control over an issue, really, as well. Kind of, you have much more of a say probably than even a lot of MPs do, for example. So, but let's not diminish the role that PR people play as leaders and chief execs of PR agencies. There are some pretty major agencies out there which are much bigger than some of our charities, and you know, are big businesses, and you know, and a lot of women are running those, so they're very successful.
Okay, Gail?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Stephen. I was also thinking about perhaps it is easier, maybe that's more, maybe charity boards are more alert to the benefits of having a comms person there, and it fits their needs more. But I think also, if we're thinking about the private sector, at that level, there's an absolute focus on shareholder value. And so I think the question for a comms person is, what do you bring that absolutely supports shareholder value and prevents the reduction in it? And if you can start talking that language, which I think some of the other questions are about barriers and things, actually you have to start talking the language of a CEO as well when you're in front of agencies and boards and things. And so actually, if people have this phrase like think yourself into the job, which I always kind of struggle a little bit with kind of applying, but actually it's about the language, and it's about understanding, if you're in that job, what your focus has to be. And to me, shareholder value, who better to protect that? I talked about reputation earlier. Who better to protect and enhance that than somebody who has comms at their very heart?
And it's interesting that I think one of the interviews talked about comms people knowing where the bodies are buried in an organisation, and that giving us leverage into our relationships with existing CEOs, etc. And so it's about using that to give that kind of strategic advice to start positioning ourselves. So we may have covered some of this, but a specific question around what we believe the transferable skills are between comms and CEO. So what are the kind of what are the read acrosses? Gail, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. I think the transferable skills, and there's a flip side of what do people feel they don't have, and there's some questions on that, so I guess we'll come to that in a minute. But you have to be an incredible communicator as CEO. You have to take people with you. You have to, if you're naturally kind of an introvert or a blue type person, then you need to be able to kind of bring yourself out, and comms people have learned to do that. So it means you are able to present yourself, your business, your beneficiary, your products incredibly well, and be a key spokesperson. I mean, as comms people, we've all had to work with people who haven't been great spokespeople for us or for the brand as leaders. And so, how incredible is that? What a great benefit for any organisation, any product, to have you at the helm. So really have to speak to, I think, don't hide your light under a bushel, kind of really shine what you can do, and don't be afraid to really emphasize that.
Okay. Anything to add?
I think we've kind of touched on it earlier, Mike, in relation to one of the things that you asked about, what do comms people bring to the role? And so being a good communicator, obviously fundamental, but I mean, I mentioned horizon scanning then, but just simply knowing the business and knowing the ins and outs of whatever the organisation is about and why it's there. That's really important.
You've got your
Okay. So Michelle, anything further?
No, I suppose I just wondered that actually, the more diversity we have actually is good. So the more that so anybody bringing in sort of fresh skills will have a different perspective on the issues an organisation might be facing, or the opportunities that it can exploit. So I actually think it's a time where actually a whole generation of communicators going into the senior roles could bring so much. So I think it's not necessarily transferable, but you will, just by your very presence, bring a fresh aspect, a positive aspect to the organisation that you now are going to lead.
Great, thank you. And funnily enough, Gail mentions the kind of the flip side of that. What are the transferable skills? What are the gaps? That's the next question I've had. And so I think we touched on this in the report in terms of finance and governance. So with those two things, what are the steps that we can take to address those before getting a role? And how do we kind of then demonstrate those? And I think, Gail, you talked about sort of taking on projects in order to do that. So I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I talked earlier about governance from that perspective, and getting external roles, but also within your organisation. But I think that applies, that that example, those examples of how to can apply across the piece. So if actually you feel, lots of comms people will feel that will feel that their finance skills will be a challenge. And I think often you see finance directors becoming CEOs or operations directors becoming CEOs. But I think I would also flip that round and say, well, those people have significant blind spots, which is what you guys bring. So, we shouldn't diminish our power and leverage, I guess, against that. I think the other thing to think about is how to evidence on your CV, how to get those skills, but also how to evidence them. So qualifications obviously can help there. So I, for example, did the Institute of Directors Diploma in Company Direction, and I learnt a lot, but also it means I have that on my CV, which gives that kind of reassurance that, having passed some quite testing modules around finance, but also other things, HR leadership, other areas of kind of business leadership as well. So I think that's very helpful. MBAs would do a similar job, I think. So thinking about, or even you can just take modules of MBAs these days, can't you, as well? So, if you don't have the finances or the time to undertake a whole MBA, or frankly, the motivation, then, just modules might be a good thing to undertake. Because as I say, it's about learning, but actually is about evidencing as well.
And I think that's something that Tom Grenier from the BMA said when I talked to him. It was about sort of identifying projects in your current role. If there's a governance review going on, which I think Gail took part in, if there's a strategy review going on, Tom identified that and said, right, even though it's not in my remit, I need to get on that wagon because I've then got that for my CV to demonstrate the fact that I've got that kind of strategic perspective. So I think that's useful. Anything to add from Stephen and Michelle on that question?
Well, only to repeat the point really about joining the board of other organisations and getting that overview of how organisations are run. And lots of different organisations. I've had no financial background at all, but I've acquired quite a lot of financial skills over time. So again, as a result of being a CEO and other trustee roles, I'm now asked quite regularly to be a treasurer, and most recently, the chair of finance of an NHS trust. Because you do over time, you understand what the important things are to look at in terms of balance sheets and budgets, and more to the point, how profit and loss accounts and so on. So you just got to work at it, and then, as Gail says, make sure your CV properly reflects that.
Okay. And the next one is, I guess this goes back to the question I asked at the beginning of myself before I started the project, is why aren't there more comms people in CEO roles? And the question here is, are they discriminated against by boards and decision makers who appoint CEOs? I'll start that with Michelle, I think.
I thought you might. I can't answer the initial question in some ways, but it's a question that's been asked of why they're not more women, why they're not more diverse, other characteristics reflected in leadership roles. My own experience was interesting. I mean, what I'm seeing more and more is that certainly being able to be the spokesperson, leader, champion for an organization is increasingly part of what is being asked for from CEO roles. So that's kind of an indication that there's been a change. So I think where there may well be pockets of prejudice, but it really does depend on the organisation that you're looking at, and they are so varied around that. I mean, there was, I think when I took over the reins, I did learn that some of the trustees were, they thought, but she's actually used the phrase, she's a PR girl, despite me being kind of in my 40s by then. And I was like, really? Have you not actually read my CV? And they were really surprised at how well I took to it. So that in itself, and I was like, I really don't know what you're talking about. But it does show you that there are kind of pockets of prejudice. But I think increasingly the tide has turned. And I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there. I mean, in terms of the previous discussion, a lot depends, in terms of having skills gaps and being worried about that. Well, no one's the perfect CEO, it doesn't exist. It's like no one's the perfect comms professional. It doesn't exist. And it's all about whether you're offering what they need at that time, as Gail pointed out. And it could be that if the team already have a really great operations and finance director, it's about you be able to establish and demonstrate that you can work well with a professional, not having to be an expert yourself. So I think it really is horses for courses, and don't let anything put you off, because no one is perfect and no one is ideal when they first enter into the fray.
Okay, I'm seeing nods from our other two speakers. Anything to add?
Well, I think there are probably more comms people in CEO, or comms and marketing and PR people in CEO roles than we probably think out there. So, and I think actually, if you look through it, I mean, certainly my LinkedIn contacts, I could have probably named some more, Mike, which passed your way, but apologies for not doing that. I do think there is an issue about confidence, and I think, you know, hopefully this session and the guide and everything else will give people a bit more confidence. But you know, you can gain that through, as I said, having a mentor and talking with chief execs. You know, there's nothing like just sitting down and having a chat with someone, and chief execs would be delighted to pass on their views and to be mentors as well. And I, you know, whenever I come across a new or a newish chief or an aspiring chief exec, I do recommend to them that they find a mentor, and I often put them in touch with people.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And so that answers, I guess, one of the other questions, which is around how do we find mentors in general, but also a question about, sort of, in this virtual world, what's the best way of shadowing someone now? That's a kind of a challenge I'm not sure we can necessarily answer, but it does make, in some ways, it makes life more tricky. But I guess the amount of the geographical distance from someone disappears. If you find someone who's prepared to spend Zoom time with you rather than physical time with you, then your net is wider. So there's always that.
Yeah, can I just come in on that in terms of finding a mentor? Because I saw that question in the chat, and I think what I'd say to people is ask. Worst thing is they can say, sorry, I haven't really got the time, right? But when you ask, be ambitious, because, you know, don't actually reach for the sky, that incredible person that you have heard of or saw speak, or somebody you know works with and talks about, because actually I think time permitting, and most people will probably make time for somebody if they think they can help and give back something back. There are formal schemes of mentorship, and I'm sure CIPR have some way of doing that. Certainly we've all talked about Akivo, and I know Akivo does for aspiring CEOs. So if you are interested if you're in the third sector or interested in being a third sector, then contacting Akivo about their mentorship program, I would definitely recommend that. I'm sure Stephen and Michelle, like I, get approached by Akivo every so often to be mentors to those people. So within a reality of how much time you've got available as to be a mentor, whenever I've been asked, I've said yes. Sometimes I've had to say I could do a couple of sessions, but I can't, you know, do more than that. But at least it's a start of a conversation, and you can cram a lot into an hour conversation on Zoom if you're focused and you think about it in advance, if you have good mentoring approach. So I've also responded to requests on happen to be Facebook groups. So if you put a request out into the ether, fairly well targeted to the sort of people that you're looking to seek mentorship from, people may well step up. I think you might be surprised, so ask.
Okay, and somebody's helpfully posted the CIPR mentorship scheme in the chat, so that's there for people to look at.
Yeah. The one other kind of developmental thing we haven't mentioned, I don't think, is about actually using a coach, which is clearly distinct from a mentor. And I've seen lots of people use a coach really effectively. And I think it is about finding the right one, and you might have to try a few before you get there. But I think that's a really helpful mechanism, because I think, as Stephen said in particular, that heavy is the head that wears the crown, as Stormzy said at times, and it's good to have a safe space to work through and to some of the decisions that you'll have to face. So that's another thing, certainly something I will be exploring myself more in the future.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And this may well be the last one. We've only got 5 minutes left on the call. Any advice about balancing the role with home life? What are your thoughts about working under pressure and actually stepping in front of the lens rather than being behind the lens as you tend to be as a comms professional? No, and I think I remember Gail referencing the kind of the work-life balance element when I spoke. Gail, would you like to lead this one off?
Yeah, absolutely. And by complete coincidence, I can just hear my children coming back from their lunchtime bike ride, coming up from the garden where I am at home. So yeah, I've got two kids who are 7.5 now. Oh, got that wrong. 7.5 and 9.5. I've actually found, and I think we referenced this earlier as well, that it's easier. I have found it easier to achieve work-life balance as a CEO than I ever did as a director. And that's because you're in control. You're in control of yourself and your day, your week, your life. And it's not to say you're not manically busy, and you're probably just as busy as you were a director, but probably with more things to juggle, more of those plates to keep spinning in the air, but you're in charge. And so it gives you, if you're sort of person that works well in that, and frankly, if you're not, you're probably not looking to become a CEO. You're in charge, so you can manage your work-life balance and make decisions. I mean, I think it helps if your chair is supportive of whatever the balance you're trying to achieve is. And if it's very important to you, then you should talk about that when you're offered a role and seek their views, because if they're not supportive, and then that's going to be really problematic. It's not just about children, of course. People are carers for older people, for parents these days as well. We've got sandwich carers for parents and for children. So we've got to think about all of these things. And people might want to do other stuff in their life, not just work and sleep. So, so I'd say that probably in terms of it puts you in a position of being more able to control. Which in itself reduces stress, I think.
Okay, thanks, Gail. Does that resonate? I'm seeing nods.
Yep, definitely.
Okay.
I mean, control enables you to say no and to delegate.
Yeah.
But you are also living and breathing the job, I'm afraid. Particularly running a charity where you're passionate about the cause, and if you get asked to do a media interview at 11 o'clock at night or on a Sunday morning, then you do it.
Okay, that's brilliant. Thank you. Well, we're out of time, so all I want to do really is thank everybody who's been on the call for participating and all the really useful questions, and also to thank our three speakers and give them a virtual round of applause, even though we're all on mute. So thank you all very much on behalf of everybody who's on the call, to the speakers who've given us their time, me the time for the report, and us the time today to hear their experiences. As I said at the beginning, this has been recorded. It will be on our YouTube channel. The report is also on the CIPR site, and there are 5 further CPD points for reading that. So with that, it's 1:29. So we will call it closed, and thank you all very much for taking the time today.